LGBTQ+ history, the 200-year-old diary that rewrites history. In this video, you will be exploring the unknown history of LGBTQ+ that was recently discovered by a doctoral student in the Faculty of History studying in Oxford. While he was looking for something else, he made a fascinating discovery that helped rewrite LGBTQ+ history. In 2019, Eamon O'Keefe, who was a doctoral student in the Faculty of History, stumbled across a new discovery while he was looking for something completely different in Wakefield Library. The new discovery was that of a large volume of diaries dated to be 200 years old and had been in the library since the 1950s. No one knows how these private diaries, covering 1806 to 1839, ended up in Wakefield Library in the first place, and are presumed to be part of an earlier acquisition of old books and local documents. Eamon was curious about the contents of the diaries and carefully turned the pages. As he turned each page, he found a fascinating entry dating back to 1810 by Matthew Tomlinson, who was a Yorkshire farmer, and what he wrote gives us a new insight into recognizable understandings of homosexuality being discussed by ordinary people earlier than was commonly thought by historians. Historians from Oxford University taken aback by the discovery. The Matthew entry contains such open-minded views about same-sex attraction being a natural human tendency. The diary challenges preconceptions about what ordinary people thought about homosexuality at the time, showing there was a debate about whether someone really should be discriminated against for their sexuality. But who was the farmer who wrote about his debates on homosexuality? You may ask yourself. Well, what we know so far is that Matthew Tomlinson was 45 years old and a widower at the time he wrote in his journal. He was in the middle class of society, though he wasn't rich enough to own his own land. He resided at Doghouse Farm on the Lupset Hall estate, a mile southwest of Wakefield in Yorkshire. His voluminous diaries chronicle local Luddite disturbances, agricultural life, and his attempts to find a second soulmate after the demise of his first wife, a former Methodist. Tomlinson was an observant but ecumenical Christian. He wrote extensively on faith, love, death, and the political and economic affairs of his day. During elections, Tomlinson was appalled by the corruption, the rum drinkers having to be carried home in wheelbarrows, and the hired ruffians at Queen Victoria's coronation. He was skeptical about expensive ceremonies and celebrations, calling them all humbug. This was not a closed world. His social circle seemed to be avid readers of books and newspapers, following reports of revolutions abroad and riots and insurrections at home. They saw elephants marching through Wakefield in a circus parade and military bands who had competed to hire the most talented black musicians. Unfortunately, there are no documented photos of Tomlinson, as he was thought to have lived between 1770 and 1850. Wakefield's library manager, Miss Pickering, imagines how the farmer would look and how he would be, as she suggests he probably was very dour and a bit hypochondriac. She also stated she could imagine Matthew was the type to have stopped and chatted to people at his gate. There is no further information on Matthew, but his entry and the others within the volume of diaries give vivid detail about life in Wakefield in the early 19th century. The thousands of pages in the large volume of private journals have never been transcribed and previously were used by researchers interested in Tomlinson's eyewitness accounts of elections in Yorkshire and the Luddites smashing up machinery. Tomlinson's reflections were prompted by reports of the court-martial and execution of Naval Surgeon James Nehemiah Taylor, who was hanged from the yardarm of HMS Jamaica on the 26th of December 1809 for committing sodomy with his young servant. Newspapers across Britain and Ireland published accounts of the case, reminding their burgeoning readerships of the draconian state penalties for homosexual behavior. Contemporary media reporting on sodomy cases, often couched in the language of moral panic, Both reflected and reinforced social stigma against same-sex intimacy, but Tomlinson's writings suggest that not all readers uncritically accepted the homophobic assumptions they encountered in the press. Disheartened by the ignominious demise of an accomplished medical man, the diarist questioned the justice of Taylor's punishment and debated whether so-called unnatural acts were truly deserving of such an appellation. Matthew wrote in the diary, "It must seem strange indeed that God Almighty should make a being with such a nature, or such a defect in nature, and at the same time make a decree that if that being whom he had formed should at any time follow the dictates of that nature with which he was formed, he should be punished with death." He wrote on January 14, 1810, "If there was an inclination and propensity for someone to be homosexual from an early age," he wrote, "it must then be considered as natural, otherwise as a defect in nature. And if natural, or a defect in nature, it seems cruel to punish that defect with death." Tomlinson's musings are still very much the product of his time. Although the diarist seriously considered the proposition that sexual orientation was innate, he did not unequivocally endorse it, erroneously believing homosexual behavior was unknown among animals. Tomlinson still allowed for the possibility that homosexuality might be a choice, and therefore in his view deserving of punishment, suggesting that capital sentences for sodomy be replaced by the still gruesome alternative of castration. The death penalty was abolished for acts of sodomy in 1861, when they were instead made punishable by a minimum of 10 years imprisonment. In 1885, all male homosexual acts were declared illegal, even in private, but homosexuality was eventually decriminalized in 1967. As many as 12 countries still penalize homosexuality with capital punishment, and it is criminalized by 70 nations, according to the LGBT monitoring group ILGA. The argument that same-sex relations were natural and innocuous was occasionally advanced in 18th century England, while Enlightenment thinking on individual liberties and legal reform spurred calls for Britain to emulate its continental counterparts by abolishing the death penalty for homosexual acts. Some Georgian men and women who engaged in same-sex relationships viewed their sexual orientation as innate. In Halifax, landowner and Lister justified her lesbian feelings as natural and instinctive in her diary in 1823. Utilitarian philosopher and social reformer Jeremy Bentham even expressed support for the decriminalization of homosexuality in various writings from the 1770s to the 1820s, contending that sodomy statutes stemmed from no other foundation than prejudice. However, he did not dare publish such radical views. After all, this was an era when spreading false allegations of same-sex proclivities was considered by some commentators as akin to committing murder. Such was the reputational ruin faced by the accused. In an age of rampant persecution, homosexual men in Georgian Britain were regularly executed or publicly disgraced, brutalized by hostile crowds in public pillories, and forced into exile overseas. Tomlinson's own meditations appear in his private diary, an intimate record of his thoughts, not intended for a wider audience. While Tomlinson's writings reflect the opinions of only one man, the phrasing implies that his comments were informed by the views of others. This exciting new evidence complicates and enriches our understanding of historical attitudes towards sexuality, suggesting that the revolutionary conception of same-sex attraction as a natural human tendency, discernible from adolescence and deserving of acceptance, was mooted within the social circles of a Yorkshire farmer during the reign of George III. Eamon has said that his discovery of the evidence of these kinds of debates has both enriched and complicated our understanding of public opinion in this pre-Victorian era, and the diary has raised international interest. Professor Farah Daboiwala from Princeton University in the USA is an expert in the history of attitudes towards sexuality and describes the discovery as vivid proof that historical attitudes to same-sex behavior could be more sympathetic than is usually presumed. Instead of seeing homosexuality as a horrible perversion, Professor Daboiwala says the record showed a farmer in 1810 could see it as a natural, divinely ordained human quality. Richter Norton, an expert in gay history, said there had been earlier arguments defending homosexuality as natural, but these were more likely to be from philosophers than farmers, and it is extraordinary to find an ordinary, casual observer in 1810 seriously considering the possibility that sexuality is innate and making arguments for decriminalization. Tomlinson's diary entry proves ultimately inconclusive, but nonetheless provides rare and historically valuable insight into the efforts of an ordinary person of faith to grapple with questions of sexual ethics more than 2 centuries ago. His comments anticipate many of the arguments deployed successfully by the LGBTQ+ and marriage equality movements in recent decades to promote acceptance of sexual diversity. Tomlinson's remarkable reflections suggest that recognizably modern conceptions of human sexuality were circulating in British society more widely and at an earlier date than commonly assumed. We now conclude our video on LGBTQ+ history, the 200-year-old diary that rewrote history. If you enjoyed the video and love learning about hidden historic tales, please feel free to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon to keep in the loop when the next video drops.